Welcome to Pivot to First. Hi, I'm Mike Seidel. I'm the CTO at Pivot CX. Every day I get to work with some of the brightest minds in the industry with one goal, turning hiring and people strategy into a competitive advantage. Hi, I'm Mike Seidel, five-time startup entrepreneur and sometimes successful one. I'm joined today with David Bernstein, Pivot CX's Executive Vice President of Corporate Development. That's a mouthful, David, but we're glad to have you on the team. And I'm really excited about our guests today. I've got two people that have really worked at every level you can work in the entire HR organization tree. They've started at the bottom, worked all the way up to vice president, to run the whole thing, and chief people officer in the case of Erika. So today we're joined by Erika Duncan and Aaron Olman. They are two people that we actually met us when they got Pivot CX, and they got it last year, probably about 2 months after we had launched the new product. So they were early customers for Pivot, but more importantly, they put Pivot CX to work in the company that they were at and got an incredible result. And I don't want to spoil the story for you, so I won't tell it here. And now Erika and Aaron have launched People on Point, and Erika and Aaron are helping growth mode businesses. So think startups and companies that are trying to grow and get to being acquired, really to accelerate the outcomes they're getting through people strategy. So Erika and Aaron, welcome. David, good to have you.
Thanks for having us.
So if you could, Erika and Aaron, share with us the journey that took you to People on Point.
Started back in 2011. So Erika and I have worked together now for 10 years in 4 different states and with 5 different employers. And one of the things that we kept seeing were the same problems. So solving a lot of the same issues. It was oftentimes a lot of archaic systems and processes and kind of bringing them into the current age. So fast forward to, probably a couple of years ago, we considered, kind of going out on our own at that point. I think it's kind of been a goal, long-term goal of both of ours to kind of run our own business. And, a couple of years ago, was kind of considering that, but it was at the peak of the pandemic. So it didn't really seem like a good time to start up a business, with that much uncertainty in the world. So both of us ended up at Carefinders, where ultimately we knew it was a short-term, kind of a stint. Going into the organization or going into our positions, we knew the company was, going to sell. That was kind of the goal. The trajectory was about 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years turned into about a year. So it was a little bit quicker than anticipated. And then we got back to, okay, well, now this is our opportunity to go out on our own again. So we started People on Point, and now we're working with business leaders and HR leaders to solve their people problems, and really in the spaces of scaling for growth, optimization, as well as mergers and acquisitions. So our target are really kind of smaller to mid-sized companies, and helping them out with that HR strategy space that they may not currently have support for.
So one of the reasons I was so excited to have both of you on Pivot to First was that you really were a part of our early story with Pivot CX. You both were at Carefinders, which was a customer of ours when we had just launched our new product, and really were able to use that to do some pretty transformational things at Carefinders. Eventually, Carefinders went on to be acquired, and I think that was always the business goal over there. And so tell us a little bit about how the people strategy at Carefinders ended up leading to that merger.
Yeah. So ultimately, Carefinders, personal care company, personal health care, so providing people assistance in their homes. And it really comes down to each caregiver, provides revenue for the business. So the more caregivers that you have, the more business you ultimately have. And similar to other spaces in healthcare, there's way more demand than there is supply. So we don't have, in any space enough nurses, enough caregivers to provide the demand that exists today. So while that's, obviously we want to be able to meet that demand, but certainly a great opportunity for companies that can provide those services. So as many as we could hire, the demand was certainly there. So that's kind of where we started working with Pivot CX, because we couldn't hire enough. So we ended up, around our departure, we were hiring probably 200 to 300 caregivers a month. So, it's a very high volume role, and to be able to have that tool, to provide that experience, as well as provide the ability to get through that many candidates and ensure they're qualified in a quick enough time frame, because as you can imagine, the competition also is quite high. So, that's kind of how we all met, obviously. But ultimately that was kind of our preparation for our merger, and our sale was really growing as quickly as we can and as fast as we can, while sustaining, or building the processes to be able to sustain that growth, to merge with that company or make ourselves a viable company to be purchased.
One of the things that was interesting about the timing of Carefinders prep for sale, as well as the intersection of meeting Pivot CX was COVID, and everyone's talking and still talking about what we did during the pandemic to adapt and change and be flexible and all of those things. But as you can imagine, what didn't change was the need for caregivers in homes. So as Aaron mentioned, we've got a long background of history together, a lot of it in healthcare. We're either gluttons for punishment or we have a great time. It just depends on the day and how you look at it. But one of the things that wasn't new going into personal care was the need for the clinical support, and the revenue generating role, right? That's every industry has the revenue generating role. In this case, it's the aid. And so taking, as you mentioned earlier, those archaic systems, the recruiting was done on paper, everything was done, handwritten. And so the leaning in and trying to do something fairly radical in this particular industry, it might be a little behind others, but in this industry was using technology. And in this case, that was Pivot CX, and trying to use the QR code and text candidates. And the other thing I wanted to mention going back to COVID was utilizing the caregivers that were already trained. So utilization becomes one of those metrics, utilization of staff, how to best use labor costs, because in our particular case, and there's other businesses that run this way, the entire workforce is per diem. So the more that the current trained workforce works, as opposed to continuously hiring other ones that then don't put in the hours, that becomes the balance. So we also use this tool and others to engage current employees that weren't working many, if any, hours. And again, that challenge exists often or regularly, but the ultimate challenge was during COVID with unemployment paying more to sit at home. So engaging and having that, again, communication hub to be able to continuously talk to our current employees, or at least those on the roster. They might not be working, but at least those on the roster was another big win for us.
So, okay, let's kind of move into more general business kinds of things, and let's look at how should growth-minded founders and CEOs think about people. How should, as a founder, how should I be thinking about my people strategy?
A people strategy needs to lead the organization. It needs to be seen as a strategic imperative. I think people strategies, human capital is often looked still somewhat administratively, or certainly a bit more of as a lag or a culture builder. And that's not untrue with the culture piece, but culture is merely an output of all the small inputs every day, every decision, every behavior, every rule, every policy, every time you reward or recognize or don't, and every decision that someone makes creates a culture. And so I think to assume that HR is the keeper of the culture, well, I often hear those things, and I think that perspective is a bit archaic. I think that instead, as an owner, it's a whole lot more about hiring thinkers, about having human capital leaders that are willing to disrupt. And then supporting them when they do disrupt. That can be the latter part, usually more the challenge. Typically notice everyone loves transformation and disruption until it affects them. And so it's a matter of asking for it and then allowing it to happen and supporting, HR, human capital through that. But I think that those are the ways to think about people as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, because we all know that talent's our greatest asset. It always has been. But nowadays, it's a commodity that not everyone has the luxury to have, or to not prioritize. Right? It has to be everyday part of the strategy, and really driving force of business, because it enables ROI, it enables growth, it enables the KPIs. None of that exists without a talent strategy around it.
So, what are some of the mistakes that you see founders and CEOs making with their people strategy, especially if they're trying to shift into growth mode?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Erica's experience has ranged pretty greatly, from 130,000 employee companies to 3,000 employee companies. And, kind of throughout our experience, we've seen the same problems, as I mentioned. And it doesn't matter how big the company is or how small the company is, it's still a lot of the same problems. Typically, the larger the company, the more complex the actual problem becomes, and the harder it is to change or correct, whatever you want to call it. But they're still rooted in the same problem. So what kind of our focus is now is really kind of trying to work with those smaller mid-sized companies that are in growth mode, make those adjustments, make those changes before they become a major challenge down the road. And one of the ones that we've probably seen more often than not, even in the larger organizations that have been established, but something that it's helpful to correct early on, is as it relates to the general leveling of titles and kind of what goes behind that in terms of benefits and pay and those types of things, to ensure somewhat of an equity within the company, that it's not there's not people throughout the organization that have various titles and various pay, that there's no structure behind it. So and it doesn't come down to necessarily everybody needs to fall in line with the same title or the same level of title. Really, the title itself might be irrelevant, but again, it's really what the structure behind the title is. It's the pay, it's the benefits that you offer. Ideally, there's a number of levels that all those titles fit into, that kind of allow for that structure to then when you acquire companies or when you grow, that you can slide those people into that structure without necessarily disrupting their day-to-day lives and affecting their title, but you still have that kind of in the background. We're working with a company right now that is kind of in that space where everybody's a VP, right? And their compensation is all over the place. It ranges probably by hundreds of thousands, right? And some of it rightfully so, but the challenge is well, maybe some of them really aren't a VP, it's building either that structure ahead of time to say, okay, well, no, we're actually not going to hire a VP for this role. That's not quite what we need. But, if that does exist, we can still come and work behind the scenes to build that structure, to, avoid that disruption down the road that can be caused from either having to take titles away, or people start talking and, obviously pay and benefits and those types of things are near and dear to people's hearts. So it could be a challenge for when those conversations start to happen amongst themselves.
I think a couple of things to blend, Mike, your questions of what do CEOs need to think about with human capital, and then, kind of avoiding pitfalls was your second one. And I think the overlap is brings a few things to mind. One is hiring thinkers. And CEOs, HR folks need to hire thinkers. Past experience absolutely matters. Education matters, but thinkers aren't as easy to come by, and people who are willing to be courageous to make difficult decisions is one of those things. And that's exactly what Aaron's talking about, to stop and to say something isn't right. We can't all be a VP. It might not be the most popular decision. It certainly isn't going to be a popular communication, but to avoid, making the problem more prolonged, you've got to pause long enough to address it. And so there's ways
You
to
know,
do that.
funny thing, you bring up hiring thinkers. A long time ago, I had a mentor that I worked for who would tell me, when you hire people, hire smart people. I'm
Right.
like, okay, why? And he's, well, if you hire smart people, then you don't have to be smart.
Right.
And I
There
wasn't
is.
sure what he was saying about himself, but flash forward to now, and I've got a team of software developers, and absolutely, I'm hiring software developers that are smart,
Right.
because that way I don't have to be smart, the one that's smart about every last thing in the product, and it really makes a difference.
Right.
So
Well,
hiring
thinkers are
thinkers is fantastic
entrepreneurial.
advice.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thinkers are entrepreneurial. They blaze their own trail, right? They empower others, and so thinkers ideally are smart people who are also willing to be inside their comfort zone and outside their comfort zone, and those things are difficult. And I think one of the pitfalls, if you don't again have thinkers, or if we are operating rotely, it oftentimes it's amazing to me how many times people start solving the problem without identifying the problem.
Right.
And so that is a repeated thing. And we have clients every day that we're pausing to say, one of the things we explain, we're not bringing solutions looking for problems, right? That would imply that that we've got this toolbox of solutions and we just go look for the right problem and start plugging it in. Instead, part of what we do is to advise on what the gap is, and first identifying what that gap is. And often in a room of leaders, if you ask them all what the gap is, let alone the desired state, it's not the same. And so identifying and aligning what that is really important first, to identify what the gap or the issue is before everyone starts to jump in and solve it, because the outcomes will never be the desirable ones if you don't, take the time to articulate that. And again, title leveling can certainly be an example of that. But, it's whether it's a remote world, everyone now wants to be remote, or we're never going to be remote, right? It's not always a polarizing thing. Instead, we've got to identify what are the issues in front of us, what's the desired outcome, and the path in which to get there.
So one of the things I'll say over my career, I've been fascinated by watching, for example, nearly every PwC CEO study always talks about people and being the most right, and we hear this phrase ad nauseum. And yet at the same time, HR teams are under budgeted,
Yeah,
they're under resourced, right? And there's this giant dichotomy between what's said and then how we kind of
absolutely.
support the team. Any thoughts around that? Any?
Yeah, I do. I'll jump in on that one first because that's a passion point of mine. So you might have to tell me to sit down and be quiet. But it's one of the things that I'm going to give you a real life tangible example. So one of the things that I think is fascinating, we're all in a bidding war for talent, right? With the war on talent, all the other things that are overused. And so now we're going to win this war. And in our quiver, we have sign-up bonuses.
Right.
That is the most short-sighted, right? So everyone's going to have it. They're going to outbid each other on sign-on bonuses as though that's going to keep an employer. So the reason we do that is because that's the most short-term cost change. Right? To your point, David, they're under-resourced, underutilized, understaffed. And so the best thing we can do is to solve the short-term problem in front of us, which is give a higher sign-up bonus. When in fact, all we did is perpetuate the problem because now we're outbidding ourselves. Instead, if we were hiring thinkers, if we were resourced to be strategic partners, as David just mentioned at the table, we would not be surprised. We would have zero surprise faces around the table because we created this. We had the pension go away. We've made everything short term. We put the focus on cost, not retention, years and years ago to sit and be shocked that employees don't have the same loyalty, that they don't have the golden handcuffs, that they're going to leave for a bigger sign-on bonus isn't a surprise. We actually created it. We perpetuated it. We still are. So until we stop and resource them differently for longer term things, pay for pensions again, or DCDB plans, or pay for kids' education, or whatever it is, and think differently and resource differently, we'll have a different outcome.
Do you think that the CEOs and the C-suite out there really understand that talent and your people strategy has become a lot more important because of the demographic shift, and it kind of got hidden by COVID, but we made the flip to where, the U.S. labor market is not going to be growing until 2046. So we're going to be in this zone where there's not enough people to go around for a long time.
Mhm.
The question is, do they understand that?
Yeah. Do you think that do you see in your clients and the people you're talking to a realization that, oh my gosh, I've got to think about this stuff again?
Right.
Or are
I
they
think
still all thinking cost cutting?
I think some do and some don't. Not a good answer. It's just the reality. I can think of our clients, and
Mhm.
we have some who are, still jumping over dollars to pick up dimes. I think that that's one of the things that, again, we're working on is identifying what those issues are to solve them differently. I think we have some CEOs, though, they tend to be more of the entrepreneurial growth minded CEOs that we cherish working with, because they do know that. They do identify that. They do know that human capital has to lead. We have to leverage it. We have to maximize. People want to work to top a license, whether they're an engineer, a nurse, a software developer, whatever it is, knowing that and empowering them to do so and automating the things that they don't like to do, that's the magic.
So what are the
Right.
skill sets that are required then for an HR leader to kind of be able to work with those CEOs to get to be able to kind of talk and get people's strategies understood, to make the arguments for better resourcing and different hiring strategies and more technology, and how do you work with your clients, for example, around that? How do you coach and build HR leadership as well as talking to the C-suite?
Yeah, and I think similar to the CEO, the CHRO or HR leader, people leader, whoever it may be, has to be a little bit entrepreneurial themselves. They have to be willing to think outside the box, try new things, be able to fail, and try again. And that can be a challenge if the environment is not set up to allow for that. In this new environment that many of us are, experiencing for the first time, it's going to take some trial and error, I think, to get it right. And to have that space to be able to do that, to experiment, I think is going to be probably the best way to figure it out. And it's going to take the leaders at that level to be comfortable doing that, to allow for failure, to allow for new things that they've never done before, and to experiment.
I think they've got to have courage and curiosity, right? I mean, everything Aaron just said is so important. It almost is an inverse, like without the things he just listed, I almost can guarantee you they won't be a successful HR leader right now, or any leader. It's not just HR, but I think that everything you just articulated, it takes courage and curiosity to do things differently. And that does come with failure, that does come with risk, that does come with experimentation, and it comes with coaching, because not everyone's wired that way. So we can't even assume everyone knows how to coach, right? So there's that. And then, there's things that I was at, my kids are teenagers. I have a 16 and 17-year-old, and they had a back to school night last night, which has not happened in several years, a couple of years anyway. And so one of the things one of the teachers said really made me pause and think about the workplace. And her comment was, you have a junior and they haven't worked collaboratively in a classroom close to other peers since 8th grade. And just think about the fundamental changes in 8th graders to juniors, right? And we have to reteach them how to work collaboratively. So when you think of that as coaching and some of the things that Aaron just said, we have now an employee base that hasn't worked together in years. Now we're still trying to figure out, is remote okay? And we're doing this on a screen. That's innate to some people. That's not innate to others. So I think another skill set for HR is figuring out how to connect with people. Connection is now difficult, or at least has to be intentional. And so I think a successful, probably again, any leader, but certainly an HR leader, an entrepreneurial HR leader, is going to figure out how to do that, be curious to try new things, and to adapt, to connect to their employees or their teams the way they need to be connected to. We can't assume that everyone's, connection point will be the same. They don't all feel belonging in the same ways anymore. So the modalities in which we do that to help people engage and belong is probably a little more creative than it used to, or needs to be more creative than it used to be.
Well, since you brought up the topic of, I think, the post-COVID era, which is the remote, not remote question, One of the things that seems to be a real challenge for businesses right now is picking locations. Where do I put my company? Where do I put my facility? I've got a manufacturing plant. I need 300 people. Where do I put it? Where do I put the office? What do you help clients out with those sorts of questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it can be not only used in that format, but for those that are looking to be remote, where do we just generally find talent? But in the instance of the brick and mortar, and some businesses obviously can't be remote. Manufacturing is certainly one of them. Healthcare is another. We have to put facilities in place, and we have to find the people to be in the facilities, and there's just no other way to do it. So in that case, yeah, absolutely. We've recently worked with a client who wants to onshore some of their work. And they look to us to say, okay, well, where's the best opportunity to build our new hub, as they want their workers to be able to come in. So we were able to help them out, not only identify where the best concentration of the talent is, but also what does the competition look like in those specific areas. And maybe that outweighs, the number of people. If the competition is much greater, we're going to have to, spend much more to acquire them than, maybe a different location. Also looking at cost of living and just general costs of the organization, for different regions. It's obviously going to be cheaper to, put a hub in the Southeast as opposed to the Northeast. Just generally cost of living is less, wages are lower. So that's also a factor as well when you got, a whole blank canvas of the United States to work with, and you can be that, broad in where you put your location. So those are things we've definitely helped out with. But to your point of, now post-COVID, a lot of places are remote. That's obviously less of a challenge for them. But, now that allows them to recruit across the country. They don't necessarily have to recruit in their, 50-mile radius. They can look, across the country. We were also talking with somebody the other day who had an office located in Albany, New York, upstate New York, and they were having some challenges because now Boston is being able to recruit into Albany, just given that they don't have to come into the office anymore. So they're able to pay Boston wages for somebody living in Albany. Well, that's a major challenge. And my challenge kind of back to the individual was, well, is there any reason your office in Albany can't hire people that are in Florida, where cost of living and wages are much lower? You can get a higher level of talent for a lot less. And there's no reason they can't. And we can help them out also with that to say, okay, well, you may be located here, but there's a great concentration of talent, on the other side of the United States, or maybe you want to stay in the same time zone. We can work with them and find where can they actually recruit and pull from, high level talent for maybe less. And that remote world is now opened some businesses up to that anyway.
Okay, so we've done this successfully, and now we're approaching a merger or an acquisition. What things do CEOs and founders need to think about on the people side before you go into a merger? I think this is something a lot of business owners and CEOs, we're all out there trying to drive our company to an exit. The problem is when they get to that exit, a lot of times it's a mess. So how do we prevent that?
It's a great question, and things that, again, I think we need to spend a lot of time wrestling with, and kind of rumble with what do we want that to look like, because again, we don't take the time to intentionally have those conversations and play out the scenarios. One of the major questions are, as we do acquire and or merge with someone else, is it a holding company where we're an umbrella of companies and we kept our autonomy and we kept our independent decision making, or are we fully integrating? those look completely different. The path in which to be successful in those two scenarios are very different. And so we've had experience and are working with, some clients right now that are still wrestling with that decision. Some, we've experienced say we're definitely going to be integrated, right? We definitely need to have the back office function. We want to have payroll and finance and HR and all of those things be in the that's the synergies, right? We're gonna make up that money. And then we go to make the first decision. Maybe it's during integration, maybe it's post close, and it could be as simple as, well, how many PTO days or how many holidays. And well, we want to let everyone keep their own. Well, you can't, right? You have to be able to unashamedly jump into either I'm going to be a holding company and everyone's going to have their autonomy, or B, we're going to fully integrate. The Erica way of saying that is you can't be a little bit pregnant. You got to go fully one direction or the other, and then own it, right? Because not making that fundamental decision, and specifically early on, makes the people part really hard to rally around, right? So the communication is not consistent and is not positive with conflicting messages if we have not made that salient decision of, again, which our business model. I think the other thing that we need to think about before acquisition is when to involve human resources in that process. It's often late. Again, our experience over and over again is it's at LOI, often post LOI. But again, then it's HR's job to make sure the cultures blend. Well, typically, not always, but typically there's finance folks and there's business development and there's attorneys and there's more finance folks and more attorneys. And so everyone's focused on the wedding and no one's really focused on the marriage. And so then we again get to the surprise face of the marriage isn't working, but we really never took the time to look at what that should be. And so I think all of those things anticipating on the front end is really important.
Yeah, and one of the things it goes without saying likely, but right, acquisitions and more mergers, by the way, there's really never a true merger, right? There's always
Right.
a
Right.
conquering hero, right?
Yep.
And whether it's
Yep.
stated or not, the everybody knows who it really is, right?
Absolutely.
And if you're on the being conquered side, the employees in that place are always right. Change, fear,
Absolutely.
change is scary. My job, is it at jeopardy, right? What's going to happen, right? All of these kind of the fear of the unknown, right? There's a bunch of things that come up, right? Managing the anxiety through the change process is huge, right? That's got to be a huge piece of the people strategy, I would imagine.
It absolutely is. And there's two things that come immediately to mind as you say that, David. One is authenticity, and the other is transparency. And while words we often use, not always do we follow those in action with the same level of loyalty to those words and commitment to those words. And so I think one of the things that we found and certainly advise others in often is the communication and being it's kind candor, right? It's kind candor to tell somebody exactly what may or may not happen to their role or their job. To give a non-answer is scary, even if the fact that we might not know. And to your point, David, it's managing that anxiety. But in order to manage that anxiety, you have to role play. You have to give them options. You have to play out what could happen so that they're prepared. And so it's not making promises, but it's also not promising things that won't happen, right? Or to your point of there's really never a merger. There's usually more than becoming partners too, right? I mean, usually that might be true. We might have a partnership, but I think to be coy about the power in the relationship or in the merger acquisition, who the parties are, I think is disingenuous. And I think it's insulting to those that are part of the team because they deserve to know. They will be committed to places that are loyal back to them with communication and that they again feel that they belong to. So we've seen that a lot of times where people are less than forthright and in an effort, it's a sincere effort to mitigate the anxiety, but usually the lack of transparent or authentic information actually causes more anxiety, in my opinion.
Right, I would agree. And to your point, nobody wants to deliver bad news, right? But I think most people would agree they would rather have the bad news delivered than be left not knowing. A simple thing, as somebody who's filled out an application and sent it in for to be ideally applied for a job. Well, nobody wants to hear back. Well, no, sorry, we're not interested, but nobody really wants to not just hear anything, right? They always want to at least get a clear yes or no. So to be able to, when you're going into that situation, to be able to outline for the employees of, again, likely the one being acquired, what does that look like for them? And yeah, I'm sure you will lose some people, but you probably would have lost them anyway. But also, I think people then just have a better understanding of what they're getting themselves into, and they can make that decision for themselves if it's something they want to continue forward with or not. But to Erica's point, it's the not knowing that creates the anxiety. If I know what it is, then I can make the clear decision on, yes, this is something I want to continue to do, or no, it's not. It's that space in between, again, that little bit pregnant space that nobody likes to be in, and that probably causes the most anxiety and people to leave more often than not.
Mike, another, couple of pragmatic recommendations when you say, what should we think about before merger and acquisition? And this is a dialogue and a dance Aaron and I did at those multiple states and multiple employers, is there's a real pragmatic view of what's going to change for the employee. So again, finance lawyer, they know it's going to change payroll. They know the incentive plan direction. Right? We have all of those logical pieces, but it's the how to do it, when to do it, how to communicate it. So if you used to have a pay cycle that was every week and you go to every other week, or vice versa, those are the things that in my role or my peers, if they weren't willing to have those direct conversations of the impact, it makes things like Aaron's world really difficult, because he's left with migrating the change, architecting the change, right? Doing the actual technology change when we didn't stop to think about the impact. It's the human impact that we've got to manage. And there's a change leadership to all of that, where we've got to anticipate all those things, because again, my humble opinion, but shame on us if we're sitting there at the point of change and someone has a surprise face that it didn't go smoothly. If you're changing people's payroll, that's a big deal. And so how to do that, really takes some dedicated thought. It's not a transaction. The transaction going well, in my opinion, you have to assume it's going to be flawless. It has to be. But how we
Well,
migrate.
on the employer side, boy, it might be a transaction to the employer, but to that employee, it is the transaction. It
Correct.
better happen on time.
Yep.
Oh my, that's such an interesting thing. But I've lived through a couple mergers and where things weren't communicated well,
Right.
and people quit over that stuff. They
Absolutely.
just flat out quit. Oh, you didn't pay me, I'm out.
Yep.
Or my
That's
paycheck didn't come in
undervalued.
when it was supposed to.
Yeah.
You're a
No,
big company. You're supposed to do that.
you're right, Mike. It's value and it's respect, right? It's respectful to the employee to prioritize that. To not just look at the transactional impact, but to your point of it being the transaction, to respect the fact that that's the impact it has on them and their family. And so to expect an employee to be loyal to an employer who doesn't prioritize that, again, is fairly a predictable outcome.
Now, you brought up something really interesting earlier, which was smaller companies. This happens a lot because it's easy to give people titles. You proliferate a lot of you pile up the vice presidents when you're small, and then you grow. And a lot of the people that have that vice president title really, when I'm putting on my corporate hat, I'm a big 13,000 employee company. Vice president has a very different meaning than it does when I have 20 people. Do you see a lot of problems when companies merge where the title proliferation that happened becomes a really big issue post merger?
Yeah, absolutely. It typically is often one of those things that are overlooked. And it kind of goes back to, the previous topic that we were discussing on title leveling. And, it's either, that conversation needs to be had up front and say, okay, here's what your title and where you fit in our new larger organization. And typically it's a lesser title. As that would, to your point, a VP of a 13,000 company is very different than a VP of a 1,000 people company. And so it's either having that crosswalk, and likely compensation, they're probably compensated the same. So at the end of the day, really it just comes down to how attached they are to that title. So, there's either, you can have that direct conversation and, do that crosswalk and reduce that title, which, you might lose some people over that. Or as I mentioned, in the background, you still kind of have that structure in place to say, okay, well, you're a VP of this company over here, but you actually fit in, at a much lower level than, you might have previously. You can keep your title, if that's, if that's how, what we've agreed to. But at the end of the day, you're not going to, get what a VP does at the parent company in terms of compensation, benefits, maybe equity, those types of things. But you're going to be aligned to other peers across the organization in terms of responsibility.
I think that's the other one that really takes the courage we talked about earlier. And so to be able to level that, we've been at employers that then use colors or numbers for, you really have four levels, right? It can be green, yellow, blue, and red, whatever it is. But these 6 titles fit in the blue category or band, and these 4 titles fit in the green one, right? And so it's a way to still hold that business card title, if you want to call it that, or that's important to people. And someone has an emotional attachment, and that's important because to take that away is often demotivating and something you can't come back from. But that's a way to allow that business card or outward facing title for a community that's different than their inner level into a company that, again, has these 3 or 4 or 5 levels, whatever it is, based on size. And when you're dealing with startups that are, 30 people growing to 60 people, growing to 100%, it's really important to set those levels up first, because then as you acquire more, as you hire more, you can tell them up front your business card title or whatever, you're coming in as a VP of, whatever it was, and that's still the 5 people. But here's where it fits in the larger organization, and here's how you're seen, and here's your span of control, and here's your authority, and here's your decision making. That's really what you've got to be able to level out. If we can detach all of those things I just listed from the title, there's a way to marry that and ideally having a positive experience for both. Win-win can still be a little stretch, but ideally that's what we're going for, right? And the levels in the background really are able to be a tool, right, to be able to do that. And we have a lot of clients that haven't thought of it in that exact way. They're attempting to do it that way, but they're not marrying up whether it's an incentive plan, a long-term plan, equity, benefits, all of that into those again, categories or levels, make it a little bit easier to deal with the battle of titles.
So how do you think about, or what suggestions, if any, do you have relative to all that tied to talent acquisition? What's your thoughts there?
As far as recruiting
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said is so important, and it's about
It
the
is.
internal experience. And then you've got these, the talent acquisition teams that are trying to, call it employer brand, but that all of that comes
Right.
together to create a messaging, right? A positioning, right?
I'll talk about
Yeah.
I'll talk about the TA side, David, and I think Aaron will have some suggestions, I guess, on the compensation side of that. But first of all, is just the fact that even in our answer, we're going to tag team the answer, and that to me is symbolic of you've got to tag team the approach in talent acquisition. And so one of the things that we did in multiple employers is really grow a deeper connection in teams from TA, not operating on its own as a separate arm of the organization, often not a desirable one till as of late when everyone needs people. Now they're everyone's best friend. But instead, how do we, make a strategic partnership between the talent acquisition folks and compensation or comp and benefits folks? And that's important because of the way you go to find a passive or an active candidate, right? Either way, you've got to be able to lean in on what the potential of the role is. So I think getting to the candidate's heart of what they want in their own career is important. And then a way to be able to, again, authentically and transparently explain that. So if title is important to them, that let's know that and address that right up front. If we can explain the value of the role, or again, the decision making and span of control and autonomy and all these other things, but be honest with them up front, that might be called something different in this company because of size or scope or industry or whatever. I think a lot of it's in the value of the conversation. And then, again, if I'm the recruiter or the leader trying to entice people with my employee brand, I have to be able to speak to it and know in compensation what that means. And so, again, that's typically how we live this out in our own dynamic, whether it's now in our own company or in the dynamic of companies in the past, is having the conversations ahead of time that I would know what Aaron and our team are going to be able to recommend for me to be able to have, in that offer.
Yeah, and if it's not clearly defined, how does one go and sell it, right? So it certainly, as a recruiter, makes your job a whole lot harder if you have to go out and sell this job, but you don't quite know or understand what it could entail in terms of compensation, benefits, incentives. I've seen organizations that we've come into where they kind of are doing it on the fly, and we end up giving maybe sign-on bonuses for people who didn't ask nor need a sign-on bonus, and we just provide it or don't provide it for some people because they didn't ask. But it just happens to be again, they're doing it kind of off the cuff. But when you have a clear defined plan and where each role fits, and maybe it's a director level job and the director level job gets X, Y, and Z, well, now you can go and sell that and say, okay, well, here's what you get, here's what I can offer you, here's the package. And if that doesn't exist, again, that makes that sell that much harder. And maybe you missed out on a candidate because you didn't offer something, and you lost them because, well, you didn't offer me a sign-on bonus. Well, I didn't know I could. So that's probably happened a time or two.
Are your clients talking to you anything yet around this whole new wave of conversation relative to pay transparency?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been
because I'm watching it, right? I mean, I have 5 conversations in a week about it, and there's 7 opinions about how to handle it, right?
I'm a big proponent of pay transparency, and I think it goes much further than just posting a range, to be transparent to the public. It really comes down to, it's important for people within inside the organization to understand how their compensation is determined. What's the process that they take in order to determine what their compensation is? What's the philosophy? What's the strategy behind, are we a market leader? Are we paying at market? Whatever that might be. Because if they don't understand that, when they go to then publish these, pay ranges online, and they see these pay ranges and they know where they're at comparatively, they might not understand, and it might be upsetting to them to find out, well, I'm only at the bottom of the range that you just posted online. Well, maybe there's a reason behind it.
Yeah, and then every candidate coming in thinks they're going to be at the top of the range.
Right.
And then you offer them something less than that, then you've got an upset moment from what's supposed to be a happy time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's important, again, that they understand how they were then placed in that range. Was it experience? Was it performance? Is it, tenure? Those things all come typically into play, but, some organizations may, tend to take performance as more of a deciding factor on where they fall within that range, or they might take experience. Well, if you then understand where you are, relative to that range, then you understand, based on your experience or whatever it may be, you can at least be comfortable knowing that you're in the right place. And then likely the next person that gets hired is going to end up in the right place.
So do you see this as a conversation that recruiters are going to need to start getting better at, and if they don't already have that kind of
I would
capability?
Recruiters and hiring managers as well, because the hiring managers are going to then have to go have conversations with their current staff, right?
I think this is one of those examples. I'm going to use our conversation here as an example, something we talked about earlier, where we're trying to solve something before we identified the problem. So I have no idea who came up with pay transparency, but presumably it's to solve a problem, right? And I'm with Aaron. I'm a big proponent of the transparency of pay, but to truly be a proponent of it, you have to know what you're being transparent about. So if I have a range from $0 to $1 million and to say, this is my pay range, you could make, 100,000, or you could make $1 million a year. Well, technically I can check the box. I was transparent with my pay. But again, that's not really the problem we're trying to solve. The problem we really should be trying to solve is not only transparency to it, but understanding and education to what goes into a pay range. Are we paying at market? Is market what our goal is, or we want to be 75th percentile or 50th percentile. And to your point, David, or everybody thinks you're going to be at the top. In a pay for performance culture, very few, if any, are ever at the top. Because if so, you don't have a pay for performance culture because there's nowhere else to aspire to be.
Right.
So there's a fundamental disconnect from candidates wanting to come in and be at the top, and a company that's a learning culture, a learning organization, to say, we always want to aspire to more and more greatness and we'll continue to raise the bar. That disconnect from the beginning means that we will never, ever intersect at the same, place. So again, we didn't identify what the problem was. We jumped in and all solved it with pay transparency. And my concern is fundamentally we'll check the box that it's transparent without actually having gained the benefit and the value of the conversation and the respect to the organization.
I'd imagine that the emotional experience of feeling fairness, it must play somewhere in this, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I might not like it, but if I feel like it's fair, then maybe I'm not as grumbly versus, right?
Well, yeah, to your point is as long as I know that the person next to me got treated the same way, they might not get paid the exact amount, but it was based on the same criteria.
Mhm.
Then you can at least say, okay, yep, I might not like it, but at least it's fair.
Right.
And if you don't like it at the end of the day, you still can go somewhere else. But at least you're confident that the next person are going to be evaluated on the same criteria.
And I think that's an example of something when Aaron said earlier that in our own careers and our own, kind of dynamic back and forth of the two of us, we realized we were solving the same issues over and over again, and not realizing, and we're working with clients today that are, professional organizations, whether it's real estate, attorneys, physicians, all of these professional roles that truly don't understand the art and the science of compensation. And so they aren't able to articulate and communicate it because they really don't understand it. And so the point that one of the things that we do over and over again with clients, and again, those were real examples I just listed now, is to educate HR and certainly talent acquisition, as well as leaders and hiring managers, as well as candidates, to again be able to calibrate on what the expectations are. Because to your point of the emotional feeling or fairness or equity or perception, which is really what all of that is, the perception of all of those, again, if we haven't calibrated, we'll never match. And therefore, you've made a good opportunity, a rough experience that is something, again, we could have avoided. So I think that having the transparency first better be internal. I'm all for external transparency, but again, all we did is check a box. The internal transparency is first, is to say, here's the factors, here's the criteria, here's the scale, here's our target. If the target is $20 to $60, most of you, Aaron's, helped train multiple people where here's the bell curve. So the majority, 80% of the people are going to be right here, right? You want 80% in the middle of the bell curve and 10% and 10%. Explaining that makes them go, oh, okay, so everybody's not at the top. Without that education, how would you expect a recruiter to sell a job that isn't at the top of the range of $100,000 to $1 million, right? So it's the transparency, in my opinion, to truly have the desired effect is much deeper than just publishing the scale.
Right.
So let's go ahead and wrap things up with a couple of final questions. I ask all the guests these three questions, and so there's no wrong answers. And just kind of just shoot from the heart here. So, what business book is your favorite business book that maybe has helped you change the way that you look at the world? And we'll start with Erika.
Oh, pressure's on, huh?
Just don't pick the same one that I would.
Yeah, I know. Now we're going to have to.
Meanwhile, Aaron is Googling furiously.
So I'm going to go with my reaction to favorite is typically a Brene Brown book because it makes me think the most. So Dare to Lead, I love. Atlas of the Heart, I'm listening to right now. And so I think that those are probably my go-tos, but I will tell you that great leaders or good leaders ask great questions. I believe it's John Maxwell. I'm a question kind of girl. Goes with my desire for curiosity. So I think Maxwell's probably the overall favorite.
Aaron?
I would, favorite's just hard to pick. But one that's probably at least impacted me in my career the most, or I've at least, it's a simple concept, that I've taken, and been able to utilize time and time again. And it comes, in change management, is probably Simon Sinek's Start With Why. The simple concept of just starting, like, why are we making this change, and explaining that to people goes a long way, going back to the transparency in mergers and acquisitions and or implementations of systems or whatever it may be. To just start with the simple concept of why are we making this change, I think goes a long way with a lot of people, and it can really help them understand the need for it.
Mhm.
Okay, next question here. Favorite movie?
All these big words of favorite and like all time, and that's just pressure. Can I tell you the favorite in the last like year or so?
Sure.
I would say for me, and what's the category? These are hard. I think the most memorable movie in the last year, let's put it that way, I'll say that is Underdog. And I think that the Kurt Warner story was just an impactful story. I think that I happen to be a Zachary Levi fan, so I think that was part of it. My kids are at the right age, and my son's playing football, so probably a lot of reasons. But I think that's probably the most memorable movie in the last year. But Central Intelligence definitely makes me laugh the most. On a different end of that spectrum, I could watch Central Intelligence weekly.
Yeah, again, favorite is tough for me. But one of my tops that I could always sit down and watch, probably beginning to end without a problem, is probably Shawshank Redemption. It's just, it's a classic in my opinion.
Classic. Yeah. The human spirit, right?
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and then final question. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience that we didn't talk about?
That's my favorite question, actually. I
Yeah.
always ask that as well. That's why Aaron's smiling. And yes, for me, I think two things. Own your hustle. Own your own hustle. Define what your own hustle is nowadays. Own it. Be unapologetically focused and committed to it. And just define what that is for you and whatever's right for you, but do it out loud, do it intentionally, and really be unapologetic about leaning into it.
Yeah. Oh boy. I'm not a big open-ended question type of person. It's just way too open-ended.
Between the two of you, you're kind of the analyst, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, you can tell, right?
Did you notice?
Just a little bit.
I prefer direct questions.
Where I'm like, let's talk more about white space and esoteric things, and
Yeah.
it's one of the pleasures 10 years in, right? We can probably answer for each other maybe better than ourselves. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron? You could probably answer. What would I
Yeah,
say? I want you
probably.
to talk about. Answer
Yeah,
it that way, right?
Yeah, that would probably be easy.
Good compliment to each other, though, right? The yin and
It
the yang
is.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, that certainly is.
We
Well,
abuse
Well,
one another.
I'll give you an easy closed-ended question.
Okay.
So, somebody in our audience wants to get a hold of either of you. How do they do that?
Absolutely. So they can visit our website, peopleonpoint.org. There's a contact us form. I think that's probably the easiest way for them to get to us directly. That's probably the simplest way.
All right, Aaron Olman, Erika Duncan, thank you so much for joining us. We're really, really glad you could be with us today. To everybody in our audience, hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Bye, Dave.
Bye.